Thank you very much, Isobel, for joining us. And I'll just let our viewers know that Isobel is the daughter of Duncan and Joanne. And Duncan is a very good friend and, as it were, neighbor. And we have had some great conversations beginning last summer when we were allowed to congregate in places like the King's Arms and so on. Isobel and I have had some good conversations about religion and history and Shakespeare and all sorts of things. And so what we're doing today for the first time is we're actually speaking over Zoom about some of the questions that were raised in the summer and some other questions that have arisen since then. And we're going to include this in our Corona Conversations category. So Isobel, over to you.
Where do you want me to start?
Well, the questions that you had. Well, the first question, let's say the question that's most pressing at the moment, that's most on your mind about the religious studies course that you're doing. And just tell us, is this GCSE or?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is a GCSE course on religious studies.
Yeah, so we've currently been doing kind of life and death in Islam. So we've done war, the death penalty. So I think my main one is kind of why people still go to war, because there's different things in the Quran that say that you should and you shouldn't. So I don't know, I kind of just want a definite answer, but I know it's really difficult with what the Quran says, and obviously you can't change that. So
Right.
So we've been looking at that. So I find it quite interesting to see what different people think, because there's so many different kind of perspectives about whether or not you should. So yeah, I don't know. I've just been thinking about it really.
All right. So that's one question. What about you had two or three, you said, lined up, did you?
I'm trying to think now.
I thought you had them written down in front of you and you were about to read them out.
No, sorry.
Oh, that's all right. So tell me the background to this question then. It came up in class, and obviously the class is online, isn't it?
Yeah, at the moment. Got my notes.
Yeah. And so do you remember how the question was posed?
So we have kind of different units in the course. The main kind of lesson topic was how do Muslims respond to conflict. So obviously there were different things. So we looked at the causes, such as the Syrian war, and kind of the main causes of war. So political disagreements, territorial things, and then the problems that were caused by war. So kind of whether going to war was not worth it, but kind of worth it if you think about the consequences. So and then we looked at why Muslims would reject violence because of what the Quran says, and then whether or not it can be kind of justified, and whether they should respond to pacifism. So yeah, that's how it kind of came about.
Right. And has there been any sort of discussion between you and your other students, or is it just a question that you're thinking about as an essay that you have to write, or what's the framework for this?
Obviously we don't really talk that much at the moment because obviously it's all online, but they do get us to think about it, because they ask us, so what you have in the exam is you have an essay question where they'll give you a statement such as all Muslims should be pacifists, for example, and then you have to write kind of arguments for and against. So if they give you one of these statements, you have to think about the pros and cons. So that's how I'm kind of thinking about it, but obviously it's really difficult to back up your points because all the opinions are so different, so you don't really know what to say.
Well, which opinion have you come across that sounds the most convincing?
Probably that if someone was to kind of attack you first, that maybe you should retaliate, but only at the same proportions to how they attacked you. So you should never kind of do it first, and the main aim should be to kind of come to peace at the end of it. So the main aim of war is to come to peace, and then so just only really do it if someone kind of does it to you first, never do it first.
Well, you've given there three very important principles, and so I would actually say that those three principles you've just expressed just need one fourth principle, and then I would say you've given the kind of answer that I would have given. So you already knew the answer as far as I'm concerned. I think this is the right answer according to the Quran and according to the practice of the Prophet and his companions. So number one, your principle, you said it should be in self-defense.
Yeah.
Right? You should not be an aggressor. There should be no aggressive war. You should not initiate hostilities. You have to only defend yourself. And the second principle was that when you respond to the aggression, it should be proportionate retaliation.
Yeah.
Right? It should be in proportion to the violence of your enemy who has just initiated hostilities, and the army, have manifested a degree of violence, and you have to respond with proportionate retaliation. So you're absolutely right. That's the number two principle. Number three principle that you said is that the aim of the warfare is to establish peace. So the purpose of war is to reach peace, not to propagate war for its own sake and to expand your territories aggressively and so on and so forth. Now, can you think what is the fourth principle that I want to add to make your answer as complete as possible in my terms, as I understand it? What's that fourth principle? What do you think is the fourth principle of the Quranic, Islamic, authentic, principled response to aggression?
I kind of have two that I have in mind. So either that there should be kind of legitimate authority, so like a head of state to kind of call the war. What was the other one? And if it was the last resort, so if efforts to achieve peace had already been made and it hadn't worked, that maybe then you should think about going to war.
Isobel, you've just added two, which I wasn't even going to mention. So you're already in advance of what I was thinking. So we've got those first three, then these second two, legitimate authority, a state authority, and then it should be only resorted to when all other efforts at mediation have failed. So that's brilliant. You've now got 5 principles, whereas I thought that we only needed a fourth. And so now I'm going to add my one, which will make it 6. In addition to those very good ones that you've mentioned, I would say that according to the Quran, one of the purposes and aims and conditions of warfare is given in the surah called the pilgrimage. Surah, you know what surah means? Chapter.
Yeah.
So chapter 22 is called the pilgrimage. And I think it's verses 38 to 39 that are regarded as the first revelations that came to the Prophet Muhammad concerning warfare. Because as you know, for the first 12 years of his mission, it was in Mecca. And then for the second 10 to 11 years, it was in Medina. And it was in Medina when he had a little city-state and he was adjudicating the disputes. And we had the constitution of Medina and so on and so forth. So it was a legitimate state. But you can't really call it an Islamic state at that point because it included Christians and Jews and even polytheists in the constitution. It embraced everybody in the Medina framework at the beginning. So you can't really call it an Islamic state. You can call it the state that Muhammad was the head of. But because it included so many other people, it's very misleading, I think, in today's terminology, especially to say the Islamic State, because you immediately think of what these lunatics have done with the so-called Islamic State in Syria and Iraq and so on. So it was in Medina that this small group of Muslims were faced with the aggressors from Mecca. They were all polytheists, and they had all put a boycott on the Prophet and his followers. So he was persecuted by the Meccan pagans, the Quraysh polytheists. And so eventually they had no option but to leave and go to Medina as exiles and to set up their own state. And it was in that state of warfare between Medina and Mecca that the questions began to arise as to what do we do? Because in Mecca, we never fought back. The Prophet told his followers in Mecca, whatever they do to you, turn the other cheek. It was like a Christian attitude. Just don't fight them back. Just turn the other cheek and wait with patience for God to deliver us from the hands of these people who have effectively declared war on us, but we're not allowed to fight back. Because the Prophet in Mecca had received no revelation giving him permission to fight back. It was pure pacifism. And that's probably the opinion you're referring to, as that Muslims should be pacifists because of what the Prophet did in Mecca. But then another opinion comes and said, no, but look at what the Prophet did in Medina when he actually did fight back, and he wasn't a pacifist. And so there was a big question mark over the community in Medina. What should we do with these pagans who are trying to kill us? And are we allowed to fight them? And are we allowed to fight them in the sacred months when you're not supposed to lift arms or anything? So this revelation came to the Prophet. And as I think it's 38 or verse 38 or 39 in chapter number 22, which is that of the pilgrimage. And so these verses came down and said that permission has been given to the believers to fight back. Now it's very, very important here. One syllable changes the whole meaning of this verse, because it says udhina lilladhina yuqataluna. Now that means permission is given to those who are being fought against. If it was yuqatiluna, just I instead of U in that word, yuqatil, qatil means to fight. And those who are being fought against, it means it's passive. You have been violated by somebody else. You have had an aggressor who's attacked you. So that's why it's so important to get these letters right in the Quran when you're reading it and remembering it. Udhina lilladhina yuqataluna. Permission is given to those who are being fought against, for they have been wronged. لأنهم ظلموا, again passive. And then it goes on to say that they were only driven from their homes and made enemies out of these people because they affirmed their belief in God. Then it goes on to say, so there, what do we have there? We have the first fundamental principle that you mentioned, that you're only allowed to fight in self-defense when you've been attacked. So that's what that verse opens up with. That permission is given to those who have been aggressed or attacked or have been fought against, for they have been wronged. They were driven from their homes only because they said, we believe in God. And then it goes on to say, and this is what I was going to add as my fourth principle, but now is number 6. If God had not driven some people away, back, daf'ullah, lawla daf'ullah an-nas ba'dahum ba'da, if God had not pushed back the aggressors by means of other people, in other words, God doesn't come down and do it himself. He has people who believe in him to do his cause on earth. And so it says, if God had not had those people to drive back the aggressors, then the following places would be destroyed. And those places start, not as you might imagine, with the mention of a mosque, but it starts with the mention of Lola daf'ullah nas ba'dahum la huddimat. Sawami'u, it begins with cloisters, like places where monks and nuns would have been living. Sawami'u wa biya'un, and churches, wa salawatun, synagogues, wa masajid, and the last is that plural form of masjid. Do you know that word masjid?
No, I haven't come across it.
It means mosque.
Oh, okay.
So, and it's from a root meaning where you prostrate. As you know, the Muslims, when they pray, the kind of crown of the prayer is when they put their forehead to the ground.
Yeah.
That action is called sajda.
Okay.
S-A-J-D-A-H. And so that root, sajada, goes into the word masjid, the prefix ma, meaning a place. So the place where you perform your prostration is called a masjid. And so the masjid, the plural of that is masajid. And so that comes at the end of this list of places of worship that would be destroyed if God did not give some people the right and the duty to repel the aggressors. So what I've argued in many places is that a Muslim who is true to this Quranic revelation about warfare is one who has to be prepared to lay his life or her life down, to sacrifice himself or herself, not just for the defense of Muslim territories and mosques and so on, but for the sake of monasteries, of convents, of synagogues, and of mosques. And all of them are referred to in these Quranic verses, places where the name of God is invoked much, where God is being mentioned in all these different languages, in all the different liturgies. But what are they doing in the synagogues and the churches and the cloisters? They're all hymning the praises of God. And so a true Muslim who wants to follow this Quranic verse to the letter, as well as its spirit, is somebody who's got to say, look, I'm going to defend this church against those fanatical Muslims who are trying to attack it. So if I find myself confronted with a mob of Muslims, let's say in some village in Nigeria, in Nigeria, it's a terrible situation between the Muslims and the Christians in Nigeria. A lot of fanaticism on both sides. So if I'm in this village in Nigeria and I see a mob of Muslims with sticks and stones and swords and hatchets and all sorts of things approaching a church and saying, we have to kill these people in the church, it would be my duty as a Muslim to stand at the door of the church and say to those Muslims, over my dead body. It doesn't make any difference to me whether you are Muslim or Christian or Jewish. If you are coming to this church with a violent, aggressive intent, I owe it to my God, my revelation, my religion, to defend the people in this church against you, even if you call yourselves Muslims. That's the degree to which you've got to be prepared to have the courage of your convictions. And unfortunately, this is precisely the kind of verse and the kind of embrace of all religious believers and of all humanity that the fanatics in Islam are not interested in listening to. They just say, oh, no. They argue out of the literal meaning of the verses, and they will just cherry pick, get the verses they want, and they say, no, this is what we have to do for this or that political or ideological reason, but not because it comes from the spirit of the Quranic revelation. So I think you've got a pretty complete answer if you've got self-defense, number one, proportionate retaliation, number two, aim to have peace as soon as possible, the purpose to have peace. Number four, a legitimate authority has to be there to declare any kind of warfare. And fifth, you have to exhaust all alternative options before you resort to fighting. And sixth, you have to be prepared to fight in defense of all, not just the ones mentioned in the Quran, but by extension, all places of worship and all people, for the sake of all people who are being aggressed, because that takes you back to the first principle, that you fight in self-defense, but you also fight to defend people who have been aggressed and violated, and they need to be defended, whether they're Christians or Jews, doesn't make any difference. It's a question of who is the aggressor and who are the aggressed, the oppressed, and you always take the side of the oppressed against the aggressor. Now, there's one other thing, which is the rules of warfare in Islam. Those are very important, that you don't kill people who are non-combatants, people who have not come to the battlefield, the elderly, children, women, religious people, monks and nuns and so on. And you don't chop down trees, you don't strike your enemy in the face. You're not even allowed to hit them in the face, because the Prophet said, never strike your enemy in the warfare in the face, because God made the human being, made man in his own image. And the word in Arabic for that image is face. It's as if to say the human face is the image in which God's nature is most fully manifested. So you'll be insulting God when you strike someone in the face. So all these rules of warfare, and particularly the respect that you've got to give to your enemy at all times. So that when you get angry because you're in the war, you're not being angry against the person. You're being angry against the violent intention that is motivating that person. And so that's what you're allowed to be angry about. But the true Muslim warrior is the one who doesn't get angry at all on the battlefield. He's like a Zen master. And the person that I've written quite a lot about, Imam Ali, was known as the greatest warrior in early Islam, but also known as the greatest saint after the Prophet. So his self-mastery, self-control was so great that once when he was in a battle, in a single battle, single combat, with a giant of a man who had challenged him to come and fight, and Imam Ali fought him and felled him, but just as he was about to deliver the final blow, this defeated man on the ground spat in Imam Ali's face and insulted his mother, and Imam Ali couldn't kill him. He drew back, because in that moment of being spat at and having his mother insulted, he felt the slightest rising up of anger. And he knew that he could not kill out of anger. It could only be for the sake of the truth and justice and victory in this war that they had imposed upon him. So he couldn't kill him. And a beautiful poetic expression of this has come out of someone called Jalaluddin Rumi. Have you heard of him?
No.
He's a very famous Persian poet. Rumi. Rumi. And if you look him up, you'll see he was the best-selling poet on the New York Times bestseller list for, 4 years or something. He was hugely popular. He lived in the 13th century, and he wrote this epic poem called the Masnavi, and that's one of the most influential poems in the whole of the Muslim tradition. And in that poem, he gives a beautiful portrait of this episode, of what this means, of what self-control Imam Ali had, and how all of this came from a spiritual understanding of the higher realities. And it's really well worth reading that part in Rumi's poem. So I think you've got pretty much, all right. The other example, a closer to home, and one that is actually historical and not just poetic, is a great man called the Emir Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi. He, and they say for short, Abdul Qadir with a K, but is properly spelt with a Q. The Emir means the prince. Abd means the servant. Al-Qadir is one of the names of God, the servant of the all-powerful. And the Emir Abdul Qadir fought the French in the 19th century from about 1830 to 1843 or 44, something like that. But for over a decade, he kept the French imperial armies out of Algeria. They were invading aggressively and doing the most awful things to the Arabs. They even said that whoever captures an Arab and cuts off his ears and his nose and sends it back to France as a trophy of war, they get a certain reward, they get extra pay. So they were encouraged to terrorize the Arabs in the 19th century. And one of the commentators on this in the 19th century, a man called Bopichon, I think his name was, he said that the best path for the Arabs is the path to civilization. And the quickest path to civilization is terror, that we have to terrorize the Arabs. And even if it's morally questionable as regards the means, because the end is so wonderful that we're giving the Arabs our Western modern civilization, the end justifies the means. So they terrorized the Algerian Arabs. And when the Emir's followers came to him and said, look what they're doing to us. Can we do the same to them if we capture them? He said, no. Any French officer who complains of ill treatment from one of my men, I personally will beat the soles of the feet with a hard stick, bastinado, I think it's called. I will deliver this punishment to any of my soldiers who mistreat a French prisoner of war. And there was a famous incident when the Emir Abdul Qadir he sent a message to the Bishop of Algiers and said, look, I've got officers here who are Catholic and who are devout, and they need to say their liturgy, their mass. So can you send me a priest so that my French officers can say their prayers properly, their liturgy? And the bishop asked the general in charge, and the general said, yeah, you can send the priest over to them, but don't tell our French soldiers, because if you tell them and they see in what a civilized manner, what a generous manner these apparent savages, how they are treating our French officers, whereas we are the ones who are treating the Arab prisoners of war like savages. We are torturing them, we're butchering them. So you mustn't tell our soldiers, because otherwise what they called in French, la mission civilisatrice, the civilizing mission. The French said, we have a mission to civilize these barbarians, just like the English had with regard to India. Very, very similar. The British thought, we must bring our great modern industrial, technologically advanced civilization to the poor, ignorant masses of India. It's the same kind of colonial mentality. And that's what the French did, but even more brutally, one could argue, than what the British did in India. So this is the kind of thing that the Emir Abdul Qadir was responding to French aggression with Islamic principles by saying, we're not going to play your dirty game. We're not going to have you as our teachers. We will use our revelation to treat you with the utmost respect, and we will treat your prisoners that we capture with utmost respect. And that's why when the Emir was finally defeated, was taken to various places in France, the people who came to pay homage to him and thank him were the French officers who had benefited from his treatment in Algeria. So they came and they said, look, we're so sorry that you've been tricked like this, because basically they tricked him into. But you see, what I'm getting at is that if you look up this man, you will see that just less than 200 years ago, fully documented, this is the man who, when he was exiled and went to live in Damascus, he protected the entire Western diplomatic community and other Christians who were living in the Christian quarters of Damascus, precisely against the kind of mob I was describing earlier, who were baying for the blood of the Western diplomats and their families, and of Christians generally, because they had got this false propaganda drilled into them by a tiny minority of fanatics, that all of our problems here go back to the colonialists, and the colonialists are using the Christians in Damascus as a bridgehead for their purposes. So if we can get rid of the Christians in Damascus, we get rid of the colonialists in the West. So they were attacking Christians indiscriminately. And the Emir Abdul Qadir was the one who saved the entire diplomatic community of the Western powers and thousands of other ordinary Christians who were living in the Christian quarters of Damascus. And he came out of his house. First of all, he gathered as many as he could in his compound. It was a large house with a huge garden, and he told all of the Western ambassadors and their families to come and take refuge there. And when the numbers swelled too much, he took all of them to the citadel. But the really important point is that when the mob came to demand that he hand over the Christians, he said to them, look, we are Muslims. We believe in Islam. We have given these people protection. They must be protected by us. You have no right to do this. When they had this argument, and then when the emir, who had only about 70 men with arms, and this was a mob of hundreds, when the emir thought that he couldn't prevail through argument and that he would have to fight the Muslims, he turned to his soldiers and he said to them, my brave men, prepare yourselves to fight to the death against these fanatical Muslims. And I assure you, I promise you, the cause for which you are going to fight and possibly die now is as sacred as the cause for which you fought in Algeria. So he was making a moral equivalence that when we fought in self-defense for our homes and our families against the French imperial invaders, it's exactly the same moral situation as when you fight against Muslims who are fanatical and unjust in defense of the Christians, the very people, the French ambassador and his family, who just a few years ago was busy ruining your country. So these principles in the Quran are not just there in theory, they were put into practice all the way through Islamic history for better or sometimes more in accordance with the spirit of the revelation, sometimes less, so that these cherry pickers would go for other verses that say, kill the disbelievers wherever you find them. That's probably going to be the biggest argument against what we've been saying. There are verses that say, slay the infidels wherever you find them. So the answer is, what's the context of that verse? And the context is that when war has already been declared and the disbelievers are attacking you, then in the course of that warfare, of course, you've got to try and kill them wherever you find them. But it's not like saying, initiate hostilities, find the disbelievers and kill them. That's not what's being said. So there are all these sorts of arguments that you have to sort of be prepared for against that. So is there anything you'd like to add or comment on or ask?
I'm not really sure. It was all a bit, yeah. It explains it a lot better now that you've explained it. But yeah, like you said, I don't think there's any kind of one reason that says, no, you shouldn't, and yes, you should, because obviously it's all to do with kind of what you believe. So if you really think that you want to kind of fight for your religion, obviously, that's what you want to do. But obviously there'll be some people that don't believe it and think that they should be pacifists. So that, I don't know, is that right?
Well, you see, there are three positions. One is the position of the aggressor, the aggressive Muslim, the fanatical Muslim, who will completely disregard all of what we've been saying and say, no, 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 this is all cowardice. We've got to fight against the aggressors. Even if they haven't directly fought us, we have to just take the verses that suit our ideology. So you're never going to be able to convince those people with any arguments. They've already made up their minds. They want to just kill indiscriminately the West and all these people, and they're going to just cherry pick. They pick the verses that correspond to their ideology. The opposite extreme to that are people who say that if you want to follow the Quran, you have to be pacifist. You have to see that there's no situation today that will enable you to go to war. You should be a pacifist. But then there's a middle position, which is the one that we've been talking about, which is you do have to fight sometimes, but only under these conditions. It has to be a just war with a properly constituted authority according to the rules of warfare and all the things that we've just been talking about. So between these three positions, and you, when you answer this question, you don't even have to say what you believe to be the right one. You just say there are these three positions. You see, you don't have to put all of your eggs in one basket and say, well, I think, because as soon as you say this is my opinion, then it will attract a certain kind of hostility from people who will only take things from the negative side of the picture and think, well, what's gone wrong with Isobel? She's been brainwashed or something, and that would be aggressive. But if you just say, well, there are these three positions within Islam and others, but you just be as cool and detached and objective as possible, and that way you're just stating the different perspectives, principles, positions, postures, without yourself saying, I think that's right and that's wrong. You just say, well, this is what the internal argument is among the Muslims, and let's observe it and respect the fact that there are these different opinions, and the Muslims are not all saying this and all saying that. There's a diversity of opinion, and let's just observe this argument as detached but fair and impartial observers. Let's be impartial about it. So, Isobel, anything else? What's the time now? We've gone well beyond our 20 minutes, but next time we may want to talk about some other questions that are coming up, less controversial and perhaps more spiritual and more about, for example, the meaning of certain concepts in Christianity and Buddhism, or, in a kind of in a comparative context, if that's what they're asking of you in the GCSEs. Yeah. But I'll leave it up to you for our next session then.
Okay, yeah.
All right, Isobel. Thanks very much.
Thank you.